again. Um, our first reading this morning is a poem by the venerable and now late poet W.S. Merwin. He died this past year. The poem is called Thanks, and it is a poem in which he offers gratitude and bows before the mystery of life in all of its complexity. Thanks. Listen. With the night falling, we are saying thank you. We are stopping on the bridges to bow from the railings. We are running out of the glass rooms with our mouths full of food to look at the sky and say thank you. We are standing by the water, thanking it, standing by the windows, looking out in our directions, back from a series of hospitals, back from a mugging, after funerals, we are saying thank you. After the news of the dead, whether or not we knew them, we are saying thank you. Over telephones, we are saying thank you. In doorways and in the backs of cars and in elevators, remembering wars and the police at the door and the beatings on the stairs, we are saying thank you. In the banks, we are saying thank you. In the faces of the rich, of the officials and the rich and of all who will never change, we go on saying thank you, thank you. With the animals dying around us, taking our feelings, we are saying thank you. With the forests falling faster than the minutes of our lives, we are saying thank you. With the words going out like cells of a brain, with the cities growing over us, we are saying thank you, faster and faster, with nobody listening. We are saying thank you, thank you. We are saying and waving, dark though it is. Our assigned Bible reading for this morning is another reading from the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. This is from chapter 61. I may have mistyped it in the order of service. Chapter 61, verses 1 through 4 and verses 8 through 11. And this is what the prophet wrote. The Spirit of God is upon me because the Holy One has anointed me. They have sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim release to those held captive and liberation to those in prison, to announce a year of favor from the Holy One and the day of God's vindication, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to give them a wreath of flowers instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of tears, a cloak of praise instead of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastation of many generations. For I, the Holy One, love justice. I hate robbery and wrongdoing. So I will faithfully compensate you, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you. Your descendants will be renowned among the nations, and your offspring among the people. All who see you will acknowledge that you are a people whom God has blessed. I will greatly rejoice in the Holy One. My whole being will exult in my God. For God has clothed me with the garments of salvation and wrapped me in a mantle of justice, the way a bridegroom puts on a garland and a bride adorns herself with jewels. For as the earth brings forth its tender shoots, and as a garden causes the seedlings to spring up, so the Holy One will cause justice to sprout and praises to spring up before all the nations. This is God's good news. In my death and dying class the other day, yes, I do every fall teach a class on death and dying at Rutgers Camden. I do not ask for volunteers. We were talking about public mourning rituals. We had just read a number of COVID-related essays, mostly newspaper articles, mostly from earlier this year when everything felt like a fresh new hell. There were reports on people in various facets of the death care industry, funeral homes that were adjusting for virtual funerals, a local cemetery and crematorium that put a limit on the number of bodies they accepted each day so they could maintain an atmosphere of dignity instead of looking like the world's most morbid warehouse. We read about challenges to long-standing mourning practices like Black church homegoing ceremonies and the Jewish Hevra Kadisha societies who wash and sing prayers over the dead. And there's a feature on one of the world's beautiful souls, a man who lives in West Oak Lane and whose job it is to transport the dead from homes or hospitals or care facilities to the funeral homes or cemeteries that will prep them for whatever ceremony awaits. It was a lot to ask of undergraduates who themselves are navigating this pandemic. Some of them got lost this semester under the weight of doing classes online from wherever they're living. Some are working jobs that put them at risk of exposure. Some have had family members test positive or have tested positive themselves. But they jumped into the reading and our discussion. The one that they seemed most taken with was the essay about public mourning. The author, Joshua Leydon, is an Orthodox Jew whose central argument took us back to a discussion on Jewish mourning practices that include sitting Shiva, returning to regular life activity in stages, and saying prayers at prescribed times. Every time I teach this class without fail, there is at least one non-Jewish student, usually more, who speak up with a reservation about how scripting mourning seems insincere and somehow troubling to them. But Leydon traces out a counter argument that says insisting on sincerity or depth of feeling diminishes mourning because then it is only the work of those who feel loss the most keenly. Instead, he says scripted practices such as sitting Shiva are by their nature public, or at least semi-public. And what they do is widen the circle. Instead of insisting on deep feelings, they invite and encourage and insist that a greater number of people should shoulder part of the work of mourning. Leydon argues that the lack of public mourning over COVID-19 is an indictment of us all because it leaves an ever-growing number of people to hold their grief privately in fractured communities that are connected, if they are connected, by screens, while we remain in national denial about the scope of the crisis and the loss. And yes, this is the Sunday when our Advent wreath speaks to us of joy. But joy is hollow and escapist if we don't name the truths it stands in relief against. That class conversation reminded me of the largest public scale mourning that I remember, and that most of my students were too young to register. Some weren't even born yet. On September 11, 2001, I was working in hospice and I was in a team meeting when we got word of the attacks. And we sat numb around a table, struggling to even name our feelings. The next day, my next door neighbor and I sat on our stoops and talked about donating blood, and we registered the eerie quiet of the absence of planes, no contrails slashing the blue above us. Soon after, All of the television networks broadcast an interfaith memorial service from the National Cathedral, led by then President George W. Bush and Billy Graham. Whatever your thoughts about that president, and whatever your thoughts about the president co-leading a religious event with a Protestant evangelist from the pulpit of an Episcopalian church, it was nonetheless an event that invited the entire nation into the work of mourning. What have we had now? We had another 9/11 this past Friday. There was one on Thursday too, and on Wednesday. Since March, we've had nearly 100 9/11s. And the director of the CDC just predicted that we could have another 9/11 every day for the next 2 to 3 months at the rate we're going. But we have no public lament. Instead, we have a deceitful and preening narcissist who insists that everything is just dandy and that we should pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. And we have protesters threatening public schools and holding menacing gatherings outside their homes, scaring their children for having the temerity to protect public health. Some of them have done so just up the street from Melinda and Jay. It's the Sunday of Advent joy. And the most despairing hour I know every day is the one I spend with the truth-telling of the Philadelphia Inquirer over breakfast. What does joy look like when we are also determined to tell the truth? Our assigned Bible reading this morning is another one from the late chapters of Isaiah. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that Isaiah was written in at least two distinct historical periods. During the first period, the Hebrew people were divided between a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And the first roughly half of the book was written from Jerusalem in the 8th century BCE, where the prophet watched as the Assyrian Empire swallowed up the northern kingdom. The second half of the book starts sometime in the 6th century BCE, so a couple of hundred years later, over a period of time during which the Babylonian Empire had swept into the southern kingdom and carried its people off to parts unknown. And that second part of the book starts, "Comfort, oh comfort my people," from the place of despair. That's how it begins. That's the passage that nourished Linda's sermon last week. It's the prophet imagining God's own speech as the people learned that Babylon, their captor, has been defeated, and Cyrus the Great of Persia was going to send them back home to rebuild the temple and reestablish governance. Comfort, oh comfort my people, for hope is on the horizon and joy is within reach. But by the time the third act of the book rolls around, they're back in Jerusalem and finding out that rebuilding is more difficult in reality than it is in theory. There's more sweat and blood than there is glory. It's hard to reassemble the sheen from the temple's rubble. Politics still bends under the burden of compromise, and yet the prophet speaks in the present tense of what is not, but might yet be. God has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners. It's the mission that Jesus claimed for himself in the Gospel of Luke. Those who mourn will find comfort and will decorate themselves with flowers instead of with the ashes of grief. There will be justice for all people, and I will rejoice in the Holy One. My whole being shall exalt in my God. It's bodily. All of this is joy that the prophet names and summons and conjures in the midst of disappointment. Nor do they shy away from telling the present truths. The quote, they shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. It only makes sense if those ruins are crunching underfoot. Which is to say, if we follow the Advent injunction to keep awake, and if we know that wisdom starts with paying attention, and if we believe that the prophet's job starts with telling the truth, and if we feel in our bodies the weight of the present moment, then joy is an act of resistance. And I don't mean tinseled Christmas cheer, which might be fun, but which is also temporary and manufactured. I mean joy as the ember that we tend and stoke and that keeps alive the possibility of otherwise, as other truths would overwhelm us. It is an act of resistance against whatever moods the moment may dictate. It is an act of resistance against the empire of the few who thrive on the suffering of the many. It is an act of resistance against the powers of death. I wonder, what kindles joy in you in spite of everything? I'll name a few things for myself, keeping them small and honest, which is where it starts. I'm working at home these days, which means I have to take walks to keep myself sane. Much of my life has shrunk to the back room of our house, where I now have a standing desk and glue my eyeballs to this very 13-inch screen for several hours a day. So I walk to get air and perspective. And the other day I was walking down Upsall Street, which is wide and busy and on which people drive like they've lost all their patience and their minds. I was by Upsall Gardens apartments, and from across the street, I heard puck, 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 puck. And I stopped and fixed my gaze on the line of trees directly across from me. And there in the littlest, possibly dead one, tossing splinters with not a care in the world except finding lunch, was a pileated woodpecker, the big ones, Philly edition. I stood transfixed for several long moments, just watching it until people thought I was troubled, and then watching it a little bit longer. And then I finished with my walk with secret knowledge of the day's gloriously unassuming gift. Another. This week, our friends and members' Facebook page was repurposed, as you heard, for repurposing. Maybe you saw it too. Aaron drafted up the Environmental Justice Center announcement of ways to make this season less wasteful. And then all of a sudden, a number of you started posting and exchanging items. I know of at least one birthday present that's going to make someone super happy, but I won't say it out loud just in case they happen to be in church this morning. That flurry of activity brought me joy. This semester, I received not one, but two of the messages that teachers need to get every now and again to remind us why we do what we do. One student wrote to tell me that her family had gotten tired of hearing the phrase the other day in my death and dying class. The other student wrote in response to a mini lecture I'd recorded and posted on Zoom that didn't even have an assignment attached to it, but he wrote because he'd been thinking about it and asking probing questions. And he said, by the way, you inspired me to read the Bible for the first time in my life. These in a semester when I wouldn't recognize my students if I passed them on the street because we know each other only as tiny Zoom videos or as little black squares with names on them. One final taste of joy I'll name for myself. My cats. I know it's corny and sometimes they're irritating and sometimes they're devils, but we're having work done on our house because entropy. And Friday, while I was writing this, my neighbor who is doing the work was at the window below the room where I spend so many of my waking hours. One of the cats was sitting on the radiator, stretching forward to look down at him. And I swear I'd pay a year's salary just to watch the arch in her neck and the way the tips of her ears bent against the window pane. And you, what feeds you What nurtures your determination to work for love, for justice, for wholeness? What sparks a glow inside? What kindles joy in spite of it all? Because joy is an act of resistance. This is God's good news. Amen.